Hello everyone, and welcome back to Prager Paints Minis. Today we're going to take a look at how to paint a red cloak, and we're going to be using my Ultramarines Captain for this purpose. On screen you see a couple of the paints used, mainly Corn Red and Abaddon Black, and I mixed them about 50-50, and we're going to start in the shading of the recesses here. So all I'm doing is taking my brush and following along any sort of indented or recessed part of the cloak. It doesn't have to be too neat right now. We're just kind of covering the entire area with this medium shade. And by that I mean we'll definitely hit the areas with a darker shade color in a bit, but we're dealing with kind of reasonable shades at the moment. Not too dark, not too light, just blocking in the colors, almost like we're sketching out what we want to hit later with both the shadows and the highlights. And the base coat for this model so far was Corn Red, the same pot of paint that I showed you at the beginning of the video. And I used my airbrush for this over an undercoat of black. And what you'll see is there's already some highlights, already some shadows by using this airbrush, but you can achieve this naturally with just glazing. I just wanted to speed up the process a little bit since I've done many of these cloaks by now. But don't fear if you don't have an airbrush. I didn't for the first year and a half. And it's definitely a tool that speeds things up, but it's not a necessity by any means at all. Moving on to the highlights next, I add in some Mephiston Red to that same mix. You can add Mephiston Red to just Corn Red, but I like to add it to the same mix of Abaddon Black and Corn Red because I think it keeps everything a little more cohesive. And this is not going to be the final highlight by any stretch. Once again, I'm just sketching things in. Sketching in the shadows, sketching in the highlights, and refining later. And an important part of what I haven't touched on yet is the consistency of the paint. We're doing glazes right now, so that's very thin paint, and I will take out some of the excess moisture, but you can see I let it pool a little bit because we are using those glazes, and I want the pigment to pool on top. That's what's going to eventually build up these highlights. I get a lot of messages asking about how I achieve a certain look or texture on the paint, and it's really just very thin and going over it multiple times. If you're trying to achieve the same look that you see on my Instagram page or any of my minis, then it really just comes down to going over the same area with very thin coats and really taking your time. One thing I like to see when I watch other videos is I like to see their actual brush strokes rather than just showing a quick 5 or 10-second clip. So I want to let it roll here for a little bit so you can really see what the brush is doing. And this is me kind of filming it, so I'm at a slightly awkward angle here. But the point is I don't have to be super neat with anything. I might hit it with a weird angle. I might be holding the brush in a weird way. The point is you're just using thin layers of paint and you're building it up slowly over time, sketching out the highlights that you would see normally as you hold it up to the light. Okay, we're stepping it up one more level of highlight now. I've added a single brush of Mephiston Red paint to that same paint mix. So to recap, that's Corn Red and Abaddon Black mixed, about, I would say, 2 parts red, 1 part black. And then we added 1 part of Mephiston Red, and now we're adding a second part of Mephiston Red. So these are all now cohesive colors because I'm simply adding to the same mix. As I resketch over the same highlights, I start to hit slightly less of the portion of the highlighted part of the cloak. That way it still shows some of the darker tones and there's an even transition as it goes from darker to lighter to lighter. And now we're back to hitting these recessed areas and deepening the shadows. I've added another brushful of black to that same mix. So we're still building from darker, back to lighter, back to darker. And I like to go from one to the other so I can make sure that there's kind of an even consistency between the two and even transitions. And that way, if I need to go back into any area, that's easy to achieve. But I'm barely hitting it with any paint on the brush. These are incredibly thin layers, and while it may look dark when I immediately put it on, it's gonna soften out as the paint dries. And all that work so far gives us this look. You see that you can clearly see highlights and shadows. This could be a stopping point for a lot of you. It has been for me in the past, but I think I want to push it a little bit further. And the first step of that is going to be using pure corn red and softening the transitions, the transition between the dark shadows and the bright highlights. I really want to achieve a very smooth transition. This is cloth or fabric after all, so there shouldn't be any crazy hard edges. Although I do occasionally go for a more stylized, almost comic book style, and there's even some sections on this cloak that are a little more stylized. At the end of the day, we're just painting for what we enjoy looking at, right? We want to paint what we want to see on the table, so that really is up to you. You can tell that I'm just looking for those spots where light and shadow meet, and I'm putting this base color, this mid-tone, right in between those two. Very little paint on the brush, just hitting the transitions between dark and shadow. And with the transitions between light and shadow cleaned up by using our mid-tone of corn red, I'm now hitting the highlights again with pure Mephiston red. I only own Citadel Air version of Mephiston red, but you can use the normal pot and just thin it down a little extra. We really want to keep this thin and light. Another thing I want to mention is when I'm picking out these highlight portions, sometimes I don't necessarily follow what might be true to life. This section that I'm painting right now, for example, might not be that bright, but it's a large, kind of flat panel, and I just think it would look cool if I had an extra highlight there. At the end of the day, I follow the rule of cool over realism, and as long as it doesn't look ridiculous, then I think that's totally fine. We're now doing our final round of shadows, and to do that, we add another brushful of Abaddon Black to our previous shade mix, which was Corn Red and Abaddon Black. Previously, it was about a 50-50 split, so now it definitely leans towards Abaddon Black. I can't give you exact ratios because at the end of the day, you need to play with it based on how your cloak is looking so far. If you're noticing that there's not enough contrast in the shadows, simply add a little more black. If you're noticing that it's tending a little too dark, then you might want to even glaze over that with a little bit of a lighter shadow color, maybe more corn red into your mix, for example. There's not science to this. This is an art project at the end of the day, so we want to make sure that we're staying fluid and we're not getting too bogged down into the mixes. Instead, we're really using our eyes and seeing how it looks and how it feels. And this brings us to the end. We are now finishing with our final round of highlights here. I forgot to take a clip, but what I did is I mixed Evil Sun Scarlet and Mephiston Red. And in that mix, it's definitely 3 parts Mephiston Red and 1 part Evil Sun Scarlet. I don't want to go too crazy on the highlights because there's already a lot of contrast, as you can see. The darks are dark and the brights are bright. I just want a little extra pop here. But of course, this is your project, so if you want to add more of that highlight, do it. I'm sure it's going to look great. Thank you so much for following along with this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. I'll definitely be making more videos in the future, with hopefully a little less time in between videos. I'll leave you with a couple images of the completed product, and please reach out and let me know if you have any questions. I hope everyone finds success enjoying their painting.